The woman standing 6 feet from my brother's open grave had never once visited him while he was alive. She hadn't called on his birthday. She hadn't sent flowers when his knee surgery kept him bedridden for 2 weeks last winter. But she knew the square footage of his lake house down to the decimal point. She knew the name of the appraiser she'd already hired. She knew the number she expected to walk away with. She had done her homework on a dead man's property before his casket was in the ground. And she looked me dead in the eye and called it courtesy. What she did not know, what none of them knew, was that my brother had spent 30 years quietly building something none of us could see, and he had left every last piece of it as a trap, a very patient, very expensive, very perfectly designed trap, and I was the one holding the key. This isn't a story about money. I know it sounds like one from the outside, but the money is just the surface layer. Underneath it is something my brother kept silent about for 30 years because he thought it would hurt me to know. He was wrong about that, and I wish more than anything he were still alive so I could tell him so. My name is Wallace Crain. I'm 73 years old. I spent 41 years working for the Savannah Port Authority as a senior dockmaster, which is a fancy way of saying I kept track of what came in, what went out, and made sure the numbers were always honest. I raised 2 daughters with my late wife Lenora, who we lost to a blood clot 11 years ago. She was the best woman I ever knew, and most days I still reach for her side of the bed before I remember. My younger brother, Herschel, was the only blood I had left after Lenora went, or so I believed. The day they buried Herschel was the kind of August afternoon that Savannah does mean and personal. 100 degrees with the humidity sitting on your chest like a stone, the Spanish moss barely moving in the live oaks, the smell of cut grass and warm funeral flowers mixing together in a way that will forever be the smell of loss to me. Herschel was 69. He went in his sleep, just like our daddy did, and the doctor said his heart had probably been failing for 2 years without a single complaint from him. That was Herschel to the bone. He would have a failing heart and not want to trouble anybody about it. I stood at the grave in my good suit, the one I wore for Lenora, and I watched my niece Brielle and my nephew Danton check their phones while the pastor read from Scripture. Brielle is 46, works in financial auditing, sharp as a scalpel and about as warm. Danton is 42, does commercial property development, and has been married for 9 years to a woman named Petra, who I have never once seen look at anything without calculating its value first. They were the only blood Herschel had left. He never married, never had children. He spent 28 years driving long-haul freight for a paper manufacturer, took early retirement at 60, and spent the back half of his life in a little greenhouse on the edge of Thunderbolt, with a vegetable garden and a bird bath. He scrubbed clean every Sunday morning. He was the quietest good man I ever knew. I waited at the graveside after the final amen. I waited for Brielle to walk over and put her arms around me. I waited for Danton to shake my hand and say something about the 2 of us being the last ones standing. I waited the way you wait when you're old, and you've earned the right to a little basic human decency. Instead, it was Petra who came over. Petra in a black dress that probably cost more than my truck payment. Petra with that practiced smile that never quite reaches the part of the face where real feelings live. She did not say she was sorry. She said, "Uncle Wallace, we should probably talk about the lake house before everyone goes their separate ways." The lake house. Herschel's lake house. Our father built it on a private stretch of water outside Statesboro in 1965, and Herschel had inherited it because I already had my home in Savannah, and our father had wanted each of us to have something solid. Herschel had let me use that house any weekend I pleased for going on 30 years. It was the place where I taught my daughters to fish. It was where Lenora and I spent our last good summer. I told Petra this was not the time. I told her my brother's casket had not yet been lowered into the ground, and whatever needed to be said could wait until after the reception. She gave me that particular smile women like her practice until it looks natural. And she said, "Wallace, with respect, you need to understand the situation. Herschel didn't have a will. Intestate law is very clear. The estate passes to next of kin, meaning Danton and Brielle. We've already had the lake house assessed. We wanted to make sure you heard it from us." Heard it from us. Courtesy. That was the word underneath all of it. She was offering me the courtesy of being informed that the place where my father taught me to bait a hook at age 7 was being sold before the funeral flowers wilted. I looked past her at Danton. He was staring at his shoes. I looked at Brielle. She was already walking toward the parking lot, like the conversation had concluded, and no longer required her presence. Something shifted in my chest right then, not a cardiac event. Something colder, something that felt like a window closing in a room I would never be allowed back into. I drove home alone, did not attend the reception. Could not stand the thought of watching the three of them eat from a buffet over my brother's memory while discussing appraisals. I made myself a glass of sweet tea. I'd given up the bourbon since my last blood pressure reading scared me, and I sat at the kitchen table with the ceiling fan clicking overhead trying to remember the last real conversation I'd had with Herschel. It was 3 weeks before he died. Sunday evening, the way it always was. We talked for 45 minutes about nothing that seemed important. The Braves were having a mediocre season. His knee was bothering him again. He'd seen a painted bunting at the bird bath that morning, and had called me just to tell me about it, because that was the kind of man he was. He could not see something beautiful without wanting to share it. And then, at the very end of the call, right before he said goodbye, he got quiet in a different way and he said, "Wally, if something ever happens to me, there's a box at First Colonial Trust in a town called Harlow Bend. You'll recognize the name on it." Then he laughed and said he'd been watching too many crime dramas, and I should ignore him. I had not thought about that sentence once in the 3 weeks between that call and his death. Now I could not think about anything else. First Colonial Trust, Harlow Bend. I had never once heard of Harlow Bend, and yet I knew exactly where it was. Because my brother had been driving there, I now understood every third Wednesday of the month for nearly 30 years. He'd always told me he was visiting an old freight buddy named Loman Graves who'd taken a bad fall and needed help getting around. He'd told me about Loman so many times, in such specific detail, that Loman felt as real to me as any person I'd ever met. I knew Loman's wife. I knew what kind of coffee Loman drank. I knew the name of his arthritic dog. Herschel was either the most detailed liar I had ever known, or something more complicated was happening. I called information that night. Old school, the way I know. No Loman Graves in Harlow Bend. No Loman Graves in the entire area code. I sat with that for a long time. The next morning I called First Colonial Trust. The woman who answered listened, put me on hold for what felt like a full 4 minutes, and came back with a voice that had changed, gone careful. The way a voice goes when it's carrying information, it can't say on the phone. She asked if I could come in before noon. I told her I was 2.5 hours away. She said she would wait for me. Harlow Bend was a small town built around a 2-block main street, a Civil War cannon in the center of a roundabout, and a coffee shop called the Yellow Rooster with hand-painted letters on the window. First Colonial Trust occupied a building that used to be a hardware store, and the brick on its face was old enough to have its own stories. The woman behind the counter looked up the second I walked through the door, and I knew from the way she held herself that she had been watching that door since she hung up the phone. Her name tag said Rosetta. She was maybe 67, reading glasses on a beaded chain, with the kind of steady eyes you only see on people who have spent decades watching human beings at their worst and their best, and learned to hold both without judgment. She asked for my identification, examined it carefully, and something moved behind her face, not quite recognition, not quite grief, but the place where those two things live next to each other. She asked me to follow her. We walked past the teller windows, past a corridor of small offices, and through a keypad door into a room with a long oak table and a wall of safe deposit boxes that looked like they had been there since the Eisenhower administration. She told me to wait and brought back a man. He was tall, slightly stooped, with white hair and a dark gray suit that fit the way good suits fit on men who have lost weight from worry. He introduced himself as Emmett Birch, branch manager of First Colonial Trust for 29 years. He looked at me for a long time before he spoke. Then he said, "Mr. Crain, your brother was the closest friend I had in this world for 3 decades. I am so deeply sorry for your loss." I had to sit down. Emmett Birch had never laid eyes on me before that morning, and yet he knew that I had spent 41 years at the Savannah Port Authority. He knew my wife Lenora had died of a blood clot 11 years ago. He knew my older daughter lived in Portland, and my younger one had moved to Austin, and that neither of them called as often as I wished they would. He knew all of it because Herschel had been sitting across from him in this same room, at this same oak table every third Wednesday of the month for close to 30 years, and they had talked about more than bank business. Emmett picked up a small brass key, worn smooth at the edges from years of handling. He matched it to box number 147. He turned both his key and the key that had been sitting in a sealed envelope with my name on it, and he slid out a long steel container. He set it on the table. Then he stepped back, folded his hands, and said, "Take all the time you need, Wallace. I'll be right outside that door." I sat alone with that box for a full minute, maybe longer. I want you to understand what it feels like to be a 73-year-old man sitting in a small room in a town you've never visited, about to open something your dead brother left for you. Your hands are not steady. Your chest is doing something you don't have a word for. You are terrified, and you are grateful, and you are already grieving something you don't know yet. I lifted the lid. Inside were 5 manila envelopes, each labeled in Herschel's handwriting, that block letter printing he'd had since he was 9 years old, the kind you could read from across a room. The top one said, "For Wally, first." I opened it. 3 pages. Yellow legal paper, written in blue ballpoint, dated about 20 months before he died. He started it the way he always started things, straight, no decoration, no stalling. "Wally, if you're reading this, I'm already gone, and I owe you the truth I never had the courage to say out loud while I was standing in front of you." I had to put the letter down. I was not ready. I got up and walked around the room twice. Then I sat back down and made myself continue. Herschel wrote that there was no Loman Graves. Loman was a name he had invented in 1993 and maintained for 29 years because he needed a reason that would satisfy me without requiring explanation. The real reason he drove to Harlow Bend every third Wednesday was this. In the spring of 1993, when Herschel was 38 years old and driving a refrigerator truck through coastal Georgia, he had stopped for breakfast at a roadside diner outside of Ludowici, and he had fallen in love with the woman who refilled his coffee. Her name was Delia Marsh. She was 31 years old, divorced, with a 5-year-old son named Theo. She was, Herschel wrote, the kind of woman who made you want to be a better version of yourself just by the way she paid attention to things. He asked her to dinner that evening. They were together in their own quiet, private way for the next 17 years, until she died of a brain aneurysm at 48. He never married her. He wanted to. He wrote that there was nothing in his life he had wanted more than to give Delia Marsh his last name. But Delia had been in a marriage that left marks that didn't show on the outside, and she had told Herschel plainly and honestly that the only way she could love him, really love him, was if she had her own address, her own key, her own morning routine that belonged only to her. She said she needed to know she could leave even if she never did. And so Herschel had respected that with every ounce of patience and love he possessed. He had bought a small house 2 streets over from hers in Harlow Bend in 1994. He drove down every third Wednesday and every other Saturday and most holiday weekends. He sat on her porch reading while Theo did homework. He was there for Theo's high school graduation. He helped pay for Theo's welding certification, then the down payment on Theo's first house, then the hospital bills, when Theo's first child came 3 weeks early, and the insurance didn't cover everything. He had paid for all of it out of money none of us knew he had. That was when my hands started shaking. Because Herschel was not just a retired freight driver who'd squirreled away his pennies. My brother had been a serious, patient, intelligent investor. He wrote that in 1986, when our father passed and left each of us $35,000, I had used mine to pay down my mortgage. Herschel had taken his $35,000 to a young financial advisor at First Colonial Trust named Emmett Birch, who was just starting out and hungry to prove himself, and told him to do something smart with it for the long run. Emmett had done something smart with it, and then again for 37 years, compounding quietly in the background while Herschel drove freight routes through the Georgia Lowcountry and nobody paid him any particular attention. I had to put the letter down a second time and walk the room again. When I came back, I opened the envelope labeled "The Accounting." Inside was a bound, notarized financial statement. I turned to the summary page. I stared at the number at the bottom of that page for a long time. I read it again to make sure my eyes weren't doing something strange. After taxes, after expenses, after every dollar spent on Delia and Theo and the grandchildren, and the upkeep of the lake house and the birdseed, he bought every Sunday morning. The total was $38 million, 49美元, and change. I put my face in my hands and I cried. Not the controlled, public kind I had managed to hold together at the cemetery. The real kind. The kind that starts somewhere underneath your sternum and feels like it is going to bring everything up with it. I cried for my brother who had lived an entire life I hadn't been allowed to see. I cried for a woman named Delia Marsh who I never got to meet. I cried for Theo, who had grown up with my brother sitting on his porch and never knew the man's last name until probably right around now. And I cried because Herschel had been carrying all of it alone, this whole private world of love and loyalty, and the only other person who knew the full story was a banker in a small town who saw him 12 times a year. Honestly, if you told me you wouldn't have done the same thing I'm about to describe, I wouldn't believe you. Because sitting in that room, with the weight of what my brother had been, and what my family had done, I felt something go cold and quiet in me that I don't think I've ever felt before. Not anger. Something more deliberate than anger. Something that required a plan. I opened the third envelope, thinner than the others, labeled, "The Other Side of the Ledger." Inside was a black composition notebook, the kind elementary school children use, except every page was filled with Herschel's block printing, dated entries going back 18 years. The first entry was from 2007 and was about my niece Brielle. She had borrowed $4,000 from Lenora that year, telling my wife it was for a car repair and a security deposit on a new apartment. She had told Lenora not to mention it to me because I would worry. Lenora, who was sick and exhausted and always believed the best of everyone she loved, had given her the money and kept the secret. Brielle had used $700 of it for the stated purpose, and the remainder on a vacation to Cancun I had seen the pictures of on her social media and never thought twice about. Lenora never told me. Herschel found out by accident. The way these things come out, the apartment complex called the Lake House number by mistake, looking for a reference. Herschel had quietly gone back and made Lenora whole, in cash, over 3 installments, while letting Lenora believe the money had come back from Brielle. My wife died believing her niece had eventually made it right. I read that entry 3 times. Then I kept reading. Over 14 years, Brielle had gone back to Lenora's well 11 times. The total, which Herschel had covered piece by piece without ever saying a word to me, was $28,000. $28,000 that my sick, generous wife had given away to a niece who never repaid a cent of it and never intended to. The entries about Danton came next. In 2015, Danton had been under investigation by a state real estate commission for a scheme involving falsified environmental assessments on 3 commercial properties in Brunswick. The investigation had been proceeding toward formal charges when a key witness abruptly left the state and declined to cooperate further. Herschel had written simply, "Paid to relocate the witness. Amount, $70,000. I did this for Wally, not for Danton. If Danton faced charges, Wally would have blamed himself. The boy doesn't deserve protecting, but Wally does." I had to stand up again. I went to the small window in that room and I looked out at the parking lot of a bank in a town I'd never been to before, and I thought about my brother arthritic, quiet, refilling his bird bath every Sunday, making a $70,000 wire transfer, to keep my nephew out of a courtroom without telling me a single word about it. Herschel, my God. Then came Petra. The first entry on her was from 2018, year 3 of her marriage to Danton. She had been carrying on an affair with a senior partner at her previous firm, and the man's wife had hired an investigator. The investigator had documentation the kind that ends marriages and embarrasses families. The wife had been preparing to share this documentation with Danton and with Brielle, who was apparently a mutual friend. Herschel had written, "Paid the investigator to retire the file. Amount, $35,000. Petra does not deserve shielding. But this family has had enough grief, and I will not let another scandal arrive, while Wally is still in the thick of grieving Lenora." There were more. A hotel bill Danton had accumulated in Atlantic City in 2020 that included charges which no reasonable person would want attached to their name. Herschel had paid it. A tax irregularity buried in one of Brielle's client accounts at her auditing firm, a small fraud that could have ended her certification. Herschel had quietly made it disappear. By the last entry, written 4 months before he died, my brother had paid out just over $570,000, cleaning up after my niece, my nephew, and a woman who wasn't even technically a Crain. He had done it because he loved me. He had done it because he knew that if I saw them clearly, I would not be able to love them anymore. And he had been absolutely right about that. Looking at that composition notebook, I could not see them the same way. I was not going to try. I want to say something here, if you'll let me. Because I know some of you watching this have a version of this story. Maybe it's not 30 years and $40 million. Maybe it's a sister who borrowed and disappeared, or a child who took while pretending to give. If you've ever been in a room where the people who were supposed to love you showed up to take inventory instead of pay respects, you know exactly the kind of cold I'm describing. That cold doesn't leave you the same. It shouldn't. I closed the notebook. I closed the box. I walked out of that room and sat down in Emmett Birch's office, and Emmett set a glass of water and a glass of bourbon in front of me without asking which one I wanted. I drank the water first. Then I told Emmett I wanted to meet Theo. Emmett made a phone call. 40 minutes later, a man in his early 40s walked through the door of First Colonial Trust in a clean work shirt with his name stitched on the pocket, carrying a baby girl on his hip and the careful expression of someone who has been told something enormous is about to happen. He had his mother's eyes, according to Emmett, who was watching both of us from the doorway and trying not to show that he was moved. Theo looked at me for a moment. Then he walked over and shook my hand with both of his and said, "Mr. Crain, he talked about you every single week for as long as I can remember. He used to say his big brother Wally was the most honest man he'd ever known. That was the highest thing he ever said about anybody." I held that baby girl. I thought, my brother helped raise this man. I am going to know his grandchildren. I drove back to Savannah that night with the composition notebook on the passenger seat. I did not sleep. I sat at my kitchen table until the sun came up writing on a yellow legal pad. And by the time the birds started in the live oak out back, I knew exactly what I was going to do. The next morning I called Emmett, and Emmett gave me the name of Herschel's estate attorney, a woman named Felicia Drummond, who had held Herschel's legal affairs for 17 years and who, Emmett told me gently, had been expecting my call since the day Herschel died. Felicia drove up from Harlow Bend that afternoon with a briefcase that contained the actual signed, witnessed, and notarized will that my niece and nephew had been told didn't exist. The will had been filed 8 years earlier. It named me as sole executor. It named Theo Marsh as primary beneficiary of the bulk of the estate, with specific directives to Emmett and to a children's hospice in Brunswick, where Delia Marsh had spent her final days. There was a clause about Brielle and Danton. Any sum that Herschel had advanced or paid on their behalf, as fully documented in the composition notebook and supported by bank records, wire transfer confirmations, and cancelled checks, was to be treated as a loan recoverable from the estate, accruing interest at the prime lending rate. The total, with interest, came to $683,000. 3 days later, Felicia and I sat down with Brielle, Danton, and Petra in a conference room in a law office in downtown Savannah. I had told them we were meeting to discuss Herschel's affairs. They had arrived ready to negotiate what they believed was an uncontested intestate estate. Petra wore heels and a blazer like she was arriving for a deposition she already knew she'd win. Brielle came in with a leather folio and a posture that communicated practiced authority. Danton sat down and immediately began tapping his fingers on the table, the way he has since he was a boy, when he knows something's off but hasn't figured out what yet. Felicia opened the meeting by confirming that Herschel had, in fact, left a will. Petra's eyes went narrow. Brielle straightened in her chair. Felicia noted the will had been on file for 8 years, and that the estate was, as she put it, substantially larger than the family had been led to believe. Danton asked how much larger. Felicia told him. The silence in that room was total, the kind of silence that has weight to it. Petra's mouth opened. She looked at Danton. Danton looked at me. Brielle looked at the table like the table might open up and offer her an exit. Then Felicia explained Theo. She explained Delia. She explained 30 years of a private life lived in a town 2.5 hours away. I watched Brielle's face cycle through confusion, then greed recalculated, then fury in about 8 seconds. She said it was fraudulent. She said this Marsh person had no legal claim. Felicia explained, with the patience of someone who has had this conversation before, that legal claim follows the will of the deceased, and the will was airtight. Petra said they would contest. Felicia informed them that the will carried a no-contest clause, and any party who filed a challenge automatically forfeited their standing as a potential beneficiary. Brielle said they weren't beneficiaries, and therefore had nothing to forfeit. Felicia opened her briefcase. She placed the composition notebook on the center of the table. Brielle's eyes went to it the way you look at something you recognize and hoped never to see again. I spoke for the first time in that meeting. I said that every dollar in that notebook, every loan, every payment, every covered mistake going back 18 years, was backed by documentation that Felicia's firm had already compiled. The wire records, the bank statements, the canceled checks, the witness relocation file. The notebook was not the proof. The proof was already in the system. The notebook was just the story written in a dead man's handwriting. Felicia slid a demand letter across the table. $683,000, recoverable with interest. 30 days to respond before the estate filed civil action, attached wages, and pursued all available collection remedies. Petra said, "You cannot do this to family." I said, "Family is the word I've been thinking about all week." Danton was the one who broke. He started crying the way 4-2-year-old men cry when they've been found out by someone who used to believe in them loud, ugly, without any of the composure he'd walked in with. He looked at me and said that he had a son, he had a mortgage, he could not come up with that kind of money. He said, "Uncle Wallace, please." I looked at my nephew for a long time. I thought about the boy who used to come to our house for 2 weeks every summer, who I had taught to cast a line off the dock at the lake house. I thought about how Lenora had loved him without condition. I thought about my brother quietly paying $70,000 to keep this man out of a courtroom without asking for thanks or acknowledgement, or even the acknowledgement that he'd done it. I said, "Danton, your uncle gave you a life he did not have to give you. He paid for your mistakes out of money he'd spent 30 years building, so he could love a woman and raise a boy who turned out to be worth loving. And you spent the morning of his funeral discussing property values. So yes, you'll pay back what you owe, every dollar, with interest. And somewhere in those 15 years of payments, I hope you find out what it costs a man to carry your sins quietly. I hope you find out because I think it might be the thing that actually saves you." I stood up. I picked up the notebook. Felicia gathered her documents. We walked out and left them sitting there. I went home that evening and sat on my back porch in the dark, listening to the tree frogs, and I thought about Herschel. I thought about Delia Marsh, who I would never get to meet, who had loved my brother in the only way she was able to after someone had taken her ability to feel safe. I thought about Theo, who I was going to drive to Harlow Bend to see again next Saturday. I thought about the baby girl on his hip, who was named Delia Crain Marsh, and who I could not stop thinking about since I held her in that bank. The money was not the point. I need you to understand that. The point was that for 30 years my brother had been quietly, stubbornly, impossibly decent in a world that kept offering him reasons not to be. He had loved a woman in private because that was what she needed. He had raised a child in the in-between spaces of a life that looked ordinary from the outside. He had covered for people who didn't deserve covering because he loved me and didn't want me to see them clearly. Every choice cost him something. Every single one was paid for with his own loneliness, his own silence, his own held tongue. And what he built, brick by patient brick, across 3 decades no one was watching, was not just a financial estate. It was a way of living, a way of being a man when no one is keeping score. I've been thinking about this a lot lately, and I want to say it plainly for anyone who needs to hear it. The world runs on a kind of slow arithmetic. Brielle took small amounts of money from a sick woman who loved her and told herself it didn't matter because no one would add it up. Danton cut a corner in Brunswick and told himself it didn't matter because the witness took the money and disappeared. Petra lied to a family and told herself it didn't matter because the photographs were buried. They were wrong. All 3 of them. The numbers are always being added up, not by some divine accounting, but by the simple, merciless fact that you cannot do that kind of damage without it eventually circling back to the people you did it to. What I want anyone my age to know, anyone who has been written off by their own blood, treated like furniture at your own grief, handled like an inconvenience when you deserve to be seen, is this. You don't have to be loud about it. You don't have to threaten. You don't have to spend the years you have left running on bitterness. You only need your spine, your records, and enough patience to let time do the work that time has always been doing whether anyone noticed or not. Brielle filed for professional review at her firm 6 months after our meeting. I do not know what came of it. Danton's monthly payments arrive on the 1st of the month, and they are always just barely on time. Petra moved to a city north of Atlanta before the first frost. I do not know the man she moved there for, and I have not inquired. I drive down to Harlow Bend every 3rd Wednesday. I go to a diner on the main street called the Yellow Rooster, and I order the eggs and biscuits because Emmett told me that's what Herschel ordered every single time. I leave a good tip because Delia Marsh worked service counters for years before her health changed, and I think about that every time I put the money on the table. Then I drive over to Theo's house, and I sit on his porch while his kids run around in the yard, and I am learning, slowly and imperfectly, to be an uncle to a family I didn't know I had. Theo's daughter, Delia Crain Marsh, is 14 months old now. She has started pulling herself up on the porch railing and looking out at the yard with an expression that everyone who knew her grandmother says is exactly her grandmother's expression. I cannot confirm that, but I believe it. Before I left the bank that first day, I had gone back to the box to make sure I hadn't missed anything. At the very bottom, under all the envelopes, there was a plain white index card, 2 lines in Herschel's block printing. It said, "Wally, you always thought I was the brave one. You were wrong. The brave one was the one who stayed honest. That was always you. Stay honest a little longer for me." I keep that card in my shirt pocket. I read it every morning before I get out of bed, and every third Wednesday, when I make the 2.5-hour drive down to Harlow Bend, I read it twice. Once when I leave, and once when I get back. Because my brother spent 30 years driving that road for the people he loved, and the least I can do is honor the miles. If this story made you feel something, drop a 1-inch the comments if you think August made the right call confronting the family. Drop a 2 if you think he should have let it go. Drop a 3 if this brought someone to mind, someone in your own life who was carrying something you didn't know about. And tell me where you're watching from, what time it is there, and whether you've ever buried someone and realized afterward that you only knew part of them. Because I think more of us have that story than we talk about. If you haven't subscribed yet, I'd be glad to have you. There are more stories like this. One story's about people who did the quiet right thing for a long time and what it looked like when the lights finally came on. Hit the bell so you don't miss the next one. I'll see you soon. This is a fictional story inspired by real emotional experiences, fully rewritten and reimagined in Savannah, Georgia to create original content. Any resemblance to real people, living or deceased, or to actual events, is entirely coincidental.